Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Two Trees podcast. I'm John Dillon, and believe it or not, I'm here with C.S. Lewis. Not the C.S. Lewis you're probably thinking of, but Caleb S. Lewis, the author of Through the Waters, the host of Bible in Context podcast, and an all-around great guy. I asked him what title he wanted, and he was very humble. He said not to refer to him as Your Eminence or anything like that, but just Caleb would do.
I wanted Your Highness.
Your Highness, of course, Emperor. I will honor your request, Your Highness. But it's really cool to get to know guys who are putting out books or are doing podcasts. And Caleb has been a blessing to me. I loved your book, man.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really glad you read it and had me on. It's great, and it's been great discussing it with you. And yeah, I like getting the content out there because, just like you're trying to do, I want people to see Jesus more clearly.
Now, one of the things that is weird about me, and I think weird about you too, is that you're interested in more than just reading the Bible on a surface level. You begin noticing there are themes, there are patterns, there are motifs that the authors are using. And once you begin looking for them, you find them all over the place. And your book is really a celebration of some of these storytelling and teaching examples that the Bible is filled with, especially in Genesis and Exodus. And I'd love, Caleb, for you to tell us a little bit about why are you interested in that? Why is recognizing patterns so important for people who are studying their Bible?
Oh, man. So like most Christians, I start off in the New Testament with reading Jesus. And the weird thing is, he makes all kinds of references to these books that came before him. Weirdly enough, that led me back to the Old Testament. And it just so happens, the later Old Testament, the prophets, they're making references back to earlier books, to the Torah. And the Torah is referencing itself, it's referencing Genesis, and so on and so on. And so just along the journey of trying to dive deeper into Jesus talking about, I kind of stumbled across the literary artistry that's going on in the text and wanting to know, okay, why are they doing this? How much are they doing this? What does it mean that they're quoting, repurposing scripture, that are tying together all these literary structures? And what does it mean for our reading of the text? So that's really what drove me to really want to understand these literary structures, to understand. Sorry, John, did I lose you?
I'm here. We're getting a little bit of feedback here.
Gotcha. Okay. Sorry about that. I'll keep going. So that's really what drove me into wanting to understand these literary structures, and not only the academic side of it, but I really want to understand, what does it mean for our understanding of who we are as Jesus's people. And so, I'm going along back in the Old Testament, in Genesis as well, and I'm seeing one thing that I saw a lot from some scholars was that the Exodus appears everywhere. It is the way that the New Testament authors, the way that the prophets, that so many of biblical texts frame our hope of redemption, our hope of Yahweh's deliverance, the pattern in which he will do that. And so it's such a significant theme. I also saw how that appears in Genesis a couple times as well. And the places that a lot of scholars have picked up on this is in the creation story, and in Genesis 12, where Abraham and Sarah come out of Egypt. That one's pretty obvious, and a lot of casual readers will pick up on that. And also had some point out that it appears in Rebekah's deliverance to Isaac as well. That's another Exodus. And so that in particular got me thinking, like, why does it appear in these three locations? I can't see any explanations in scholarly literature. I'm seeing these kind of patterns in the text, but do they appear anywhere else? Is there a running theme here? So I go back and start rereading Genesis, and lo and behold, some of the phrases that we see appearing in the Exodus and that we see appearing in these Exodus motifs in Genesis, they're appearing elsewhere. And we find that they appear 19 or 20 times before we get to the Exodus of Israel.
Wow.
And I say 19 or 20 because there's one that's kind of questionable in my mind, and you can see that in the book as well. But it appears everywhere. And so that theme in and of itself becomes just at the heart of the literary strategy that the author is using in Genesis. And so we'll get more into what that is, but there's another motif, if you're good to go into this, that I want to bring up, and that is what I'm calling the two goats motif. And the reason that I call it that is because it brings us to the Day of Atonement, and I'll explain why. But what drew me to this was I saw a few scholars just kind of mention that there's this link between two goats of the Day of Atonement and some of the pairs of brothers in Genesis. But there was never really like, why is this going on? There was never any solid explanation that I could find. It was just like, oh yeah, there's some literary artistry going on here. And so again, I wanted to know what in the world is going on here. So I began looking at these links and seeing a fuller pattern among these brothers that we'll talk about, and seeing that actually it kind of coalesces with the Exodus motif in some places and really climaxes within Genesis in the same place the Exodus motif climaxes. So again, if all this was just an academic exercise to see these literary structures, I don't know, I may have written the book, I'm not entirely sure, but really I don't want to just make this an academic exercise about the literary artistry. I want it to be practical for the church. And seeing the artistry is important and is helpful, but again, I think at the end, what's most helpful for the church, the person who doesn't read Hebrew, who really doesn't care a lot about literary artistry, they just want to be able to see Jesus more clearly. Well, I want to be able to do both. I want us to see the depth of Scripture and how that reflects on Jesus and how that reflects on us as his people and the world that we live in.
I think that's one of the reasons that I appreciate your book and also your ministry and your podcast is that it is beautiful when you read the Scriptures as more than just a, I don't know, how to be a better you kind of a book. And you begin to recognize that the Spirit of God has given us this not just really efficient book, but gorgeous literature. And it's really cool when you stop, especially for someone who's been reading their Bible a long time, to realize that, wow, if I step back and I begin to see this is a really advanced and gorgeous piece of artwork that God is weaving together in these stories, and it's not accidental. And if the Spirit of God saw fit to put it in the Bible, I think it's important for God's people to at least look at it and say, praise God, look at that. That is something. And your book is really kind of a celebration of that. You walk through the Abraham's family story, kind of culminating in Joseph, and everyone gets excited about Exodus. Even if you're not a Christian, everyone loves to argue about who was Pharaoh and when did this happen and whether or not Prince of Egypt was a good movie. Loads of stuff. And so I just really was blessed by it. And I kind of want you to just kind of walk through a little bit here. First of all, would you mind breaking down what you mean when you say the Exodus motif? Like, what exactly is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 8 main kind of bullet points that I have for what I would say constitutes the Exodus motif. And in every single Exodus that appears throughout Genesis and the Exodus of Israel out of Egypt in Exodus 12 through 14, that section, there are additional elements, there are subtracted elements. So really these 8 steps are just kind of the core that you can find in almost every one, or at least most of these elements, which will kind of clue you in that this is definitely an Exodus, along with some additional links that you'll find from that story into the Exodus of Israel. So what we see is there is an elect one and his family, usually, and they're in a place of violence, of oppression, or possibly in exile, or just in some place that is in a state of ruin. And, we start off with this in creation with the tohu vavohu, the wild and waste, formless and void in a lot of translations. We find similar concepts throughout the book as we look at the way that the people are oppressed as well. They're in similar states of ruin and oppression. And so Yahweh, in some way, he comes to know of the situation. He sees or hears or comes to know of it. That vocabulary is used to speak of Yahweh, his perception of this event. And then the enemies of God's elect, or those who are part of that state of ruin, they are defeated or they are struck. And then the elect one, he then comes out often as a mixed multitude with increased possessions. There are additional people with him, often servants and additional cattle, livestock, gold, silver, new possessions. And then there is an act of new creation, whether more literally in the story, an act of new creation, or a symbolic act of new creation as it reaches back to the first creation, to kind of literarily show us that that's what's going on here. Then the elect is then brought into Yahweh's dwelling or his temple, into his space. In some way, they're brought closer to where Yahweh is. And then that elect one and possibly the family, they are commissioned as priests, as kings. They're blessed. They are to serve in that temple dwelling now. So they often do just pick up that priest king title. And then there is often, sadly, an act of disloyalty that results in exile and need for another Exodus. And so that's generally the frame that you're going to see around every Exodus. Some are very explicit with direct links to the Exodus story, the Exodus of Israel from Egypt, and others are going to be there's some that are very subtle and because of the brevity of the narrative, and they leave just little clues for us. But by first establishing this motif in, umpteen different instances, we're able to see how this framework is set around so many stories throughout the book of Genesis.
Yeah, and it doesn't just show you, okay, it happened this way, but every one of them leaves you with this sense of the greatness and the goodness of God, that he is faithful even in mankind's faithlessness. And even when things seem out of control, the Lord has not lost control. He is the God of gods, the King of kings, mighty and awesome. And when I was reading through your book a couple times, I just sat it down. I was like, God, wow, you are awesome. I so often doubt whether or not the Lord is blessing or what's going to happen in my life. And there were so many times when reading through these stories, especially as you were pointing them out in your book, where I just stopped and gave God glory. And so I definitely see God using your book more than just as an intellectual puzzle. Hey, look, it's over here and it's over here. But it's very practical, too, as you begin to see God working in your own lives as well.
That's awesome to hear. No, I'm really glad just to hear that what I've put into it is taking that effect, because, yeah, I mean, that's what I want. I enjoy the academic side of it, obviously, but again, I want just average Joe to be able to read this and say, even if you don't get a lick of the academic stuff, but God is beautiful in this, and he is consistent and gracious towards his people. He is powerful to deliver his people over and over and over again when they keep messing it up.
Amen and amen.
So that is really encouraging to hear.
So having looked at these different stories, I got to know, man, you got a favorite? Which one of the Exodus motifs is something that just draws your imagination back to it?
Okay, what a question. I guess, so first of all, the climax of this is in Joseph. I want to save him for later, but that might be my favorite because of that. However, I think often I revisit the Exodus in creation, just because it's so foundational to, I mean, the biblical story as a whole. It's setting the entire worldview, as well as the process by which God creates a people. Since you find both the Exodus and creation in that, it does a couple things in that. It shows us that creation and Exodus, they're not separate events. And then, again, they show the pattern of how, as creation climaxes with a people to be priest kings in God's garden, in his dwelling, we also see the first time that he uses the method of an Exodus pattern to bring that about. And then we just get to see it play out over and over and over again after fall after fall after fall, and even achievement after achievement after achievement.
That's really cool. I'm convinced I could study just the first 11 chapters, 12 chapters of Genesis for the rest of my career and not get to the bottom of everything that's there. It's so rich. And then you throw in Abraham's family on top of it, and it just is an abundance of awesome stuff and a million rabbit trails. And you do a good job in the book not getting sucked into too many off the beaten path kind of a things. You kind of point at them a couple of times, be like, "Don't pay attention to that though, because we're talking about this," which is a really cool thing for a teacher to be able to do. But why don't you walk us through some of this? What's on your mind? What do you want the folks to know?
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I think some of the biggest things that you can take away is that we have Yahweh's consistency in his method to deliver people. I mean, we see, like I said, this Exodus pattern begins at creation as he creates a people, but then after that creation and then the fall, this is not an act only of recreation and new creation, but it is redemption. So the Exodus is God's consistent, gracious pattern towards fallen and even continuing to fall people
Mm.
to bring them back to the state of priest king, to be his loyal servants and even co-rulers in his garden, in his dwelling space. That is, I mean, that I think is the biggest punch of the Exodus motif throughout Genesis. And as we see this play out over and over and over again, it shapes our expectations about, okay, God has done this 100 times in the past in this pattern. So whenever Jesus delivers us, here's what it looked like. Whenever he delivers us finally in the end, here's the shape that it's probably going to take. And behold, Brian Estelle has done some stellar work in the book of Revelation. Well, he has a book on echoes of Exodus in Scripture, and he has a whole chapter on where the Exodus shows up in Revelation. And so that theory holds true, that the Exodus is everywhere, and it shapes our hope of redemption in Christ. How Yahweh did it in the Old Testament, and how he does it as Jesus in the New Testament and in future. Something else that I think we should take away from this is, so when I came to Genesis, just well before all of this study and before I knew how to read it all that well, it was a lot of very strange and disconnected stories. Okay, what's the little moral tidbit I can take out of this story over here and the moral tidbit over here? But if this is all one book, if this is a literary unity, if there was actual style in putting this stuff together, and it wasn't just for just say moral lessons, but really trying to shape our worldview and our future hope, why are these stories back to back in the way they are? Well, now if we can see that pretty much every story, because like I said, there's like 90 of these things in the book of Genesis, so it touches on just about every narrative cycle. And so we can have expectations from that pattern about what's going to happen next. After we see steps 1 and 2 of the Exodus occur in a story, we probably expect we're going to see steps 3 through 8. Well, if the author changes one of those steps, he adds or subtracts or inverts something, that changes our perception of the story in a new situation. And we can learn something new as we see the Exodus motif play out in different ways in different situations with different people who have either committed different sins or repented or remained righteous or whatever they've done.
Yeah, I always
God
kind of
remains
view that.
consistent.
Yeah, I always kind of view that like an ancient highlighter. Like, hey, this is usually how this goes, but now the pattern's a little different here. Why? Pay attention to this. And I think that line there, that it shows the glory and the goodness of God. It's not all, rinse and repeat kind of a thing. There's tremendous variety in the way this shapes out in the individual's lives, but also this underlying beat that is the faithfulness and the goodness of God.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I kind of liken it to, just say today, young hero stories. You have a young guy who is, he's a nobody, but then this big chance comes along to become a hero, and he goes out and saves the day. I mean, that's a trope we find. I think of all these, nerdy movies, like you got Luke Skywalker, Frodo, or trying to think of some others, but that happens a lot in our culture's stories because we recognize that. Now, when we see that story again in yet another movie, is it authorial laziness or is it craft?
Yeah.
And I would say it's definitely craft, because it helps us as we see this same trope happen in a new place. We think differently about it and we can learn new things. And I think one of the best examples of this, I mean, every story is a good example of this in Genesis, but I think of Hagar, where Hagar, she actually gets her own Exodus, but she is an Egyptian. She's not strictly a part of the elect family. Actually, the elect family oppresses her. So we see that, it doesn't matter your lineage. It's about who is loyal to God. And even those who are not part of the genealogical elect family are cared for by God. That's been the goal the whole time. But just that story highlights it so well, that God even cares for Hagar, this one that perhaps from an Israelite perspective should not be cared for all that much.
I think Hagar is one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible. The concept of the God who sees, and the revelation of the well that's there. is just really beautiful. And I think it's cool. You see it also in the genealogies of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. There's this emphasis on these women, Rahab and I forget Judah's daughter-in-law. Her name has escaped me.
Tamar.
Yeah, her, and then also Bathsheba. But it's these characters who, like, if it was me, I wouldn't have put Rahab in the story as one of the descendants of, or the ancestors of Jesus. But she's woven in on purpose. It's unexpected, the faithfulness and the goodness of God.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what so much of this highlights as we see it just happening over and over again is God remains consistently redeeming people who really have gotten themselves into a mess. That's one of the most beautiful things I think about Abraham as he goes down to Egypt. I take that moment as a fall. And if you disagree on that, I mean, at least I think we can agree that selling his wife out was probably a fall. And so this very well could have been a place where
Abraham is not a great guy. So time and time again, if you're really feeling bad about yourself, just go compare yourself to Abraham, and you'll shine pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet, despite the fact that he got himself into the situation, and God at this point, he could have said, okay, look, the condition was go to the land and I will make you a blessing to the nations and so on. You'll be my instrument. Well, you left the land, deal's off. I'm going to go find one of Shem's other children and use them for this project. And he doesn't do that. He says, no, I'm sticking with this guy. I'm going to show him grace. We're going to try this again, give him another chance and keep working on this. And so he brings him out of this when he had every right to say, okay, you broke the deal, so deal's off. He says, I'm going to renew our covenant, which is a theme we see throughout the Bible. God just renews his promises, renews his kindness to a broken people.
So why don't you walk us through one of the stories? I know you're going to get to Joseph here in a little bit, and there's a little bit of Abraham. But how does this look like in some of the other characters? Like, where do you see this motif, and where might walk through just if one of our listeners were to pick up their Bible and they're going to see this Exodus motif or the two goats, pick one and just kind of illustrate it for us.
Okay, let me pick one that's, I think, a little bit obscure because I just like this one because it's not exactly what you would expect, and it's actually not God directly who carries this one out. And this is actually in Genesis 14. Just after Lot has decided to leave Abraham, he's been given the choice to take part of the promised land, and he says, no, that's okay. I don't want any of the promised land. I want that place east. I want to exile myself out to a land of sinners at Sodom. Well, because of this, we have a couple of seed of the serpent-ish nations or alliances of nations going at each other, and Lot, he gets swept up in this war, and he gets taken captive along with all of his family and his wealth and everything. So in that, we see that Lot is oppressed by a king, by Chedorlaomer's army. And after that, Abraham, he is enabled to go out and to deliver Lot. So in his defeat of Chedorlaomer, as he chases them all the way up to Dan and defeats them, that king is afflicted. He's defeated and brought down, just again, like we see that in the Exodus story. And so, and I haven't said this yet, in case it's not explicitly clear, we see the oppression of Israel in Exodus. I think everyone knows that, but let me just say it just in case. And so then we see Lot. In this particular story, we don't have an instance of Yahweh seeing, hearing, or coming to know about Lot's affliction. But in this story, Abraham is the one who sees what's going on. He's the one that delivers Lot. So that step does not appear in this Exodus story. But then we see Lot and his entire family and all those who were with him and all of his possessions. They come out in Genesis 14, verse 16. And so we have that same step, just like the Israelites in the Exodus of Israel. They come out and they plunder their neighbors by asking them for wealth, and they get a bunch. And then we also have a quote-unquote mixed multitude that come out with them in Exodus 12, 35 through 36. And then he is brought back to dwell with Abraham there briefly until he goes back to his own place. And Abraham, at this point, he is dwelling in in an Edenic context. If you go through, you'll see how the place he is at has some Edenic trees and sacrifices that are associated with kind of that mountaintop blessing that comes to Adam and Eve in Eden.
Yeah.
And then there's also blessings on Abraham after this, since Lot is not the actual elect one in this story. The blessings and all those, they don't go on Lot, who experienced the Exodus themselves, but all the rest of those steps appear on Abraham, who has carried out this Exodus. And so he is blessed once again in the next couple chapters to be fruitful and multiply, commissioned to subdue the land. He offers sacrifices that which have some priestly connotations. Covenants are renewed, and then there's further rebellion shortly after in Genesis 16. After all of his renewed covenants with Yahweh in Genesis 15, whenever they take Hagar, when they see and take her, just like Eve took the fruit. Mm. And so this is just one of these stories where there's, and I'm talking very conceptually, there's a lot of key words that are shared, a lot of lemmas and phrases that are shared very precisely with the Exodus story. So this isn't just me saying like, oh, this looks kind of like this, and so we should take this as gospel. But this is actually, you can see that this is part of the authorial intent, that there's really not a good chance that the author would have shaped the narrative in this way if he did not intend for us to read this as a foreshadowing, in a sense, of the Exodus of Israel, or at least connected. And I think what's really cool about this story, just talking about what makes each of them unique, is we see that someone who is not the elect one, but rather part of the elect one's family, someone that the elect one cares for, is delivered by the power of Yahweh's elect. So in this, Yahweh is already starting to, in a sense, bless the nations and be able to perhaps, in a sense, be the image of God and go out and be God's hands and feet in the world. So that just makes this one a really cool story.
Wow. Now you think about Abraham, and we oftentimes focus in on God's blessing of Abraham, and we miss the intent of God to make Abraham a blessing to the nations. And we want to just run right to, well, that's in Jesus. Well, yeah, that's the ultimate fulfillment of that. But Abraham was also supposed to be a blessing. Wherever he went, you get it probably best in the Abimelech story there with the sheep and the tree that's planted by the well. And for sure, I think Lot thought Abraham was a blessing, when he shows up and rescues him.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you miss it too, because you get just a little blurb in chapter 14 here with Abraham. He's dwelling with Eshcol and Aner and Mamre, and he's got this alliance with them. I think in the ESV it says they're friends of Abraham or something along those lines, but literally they were owners of a covenant. And so just as Abimelech will in a few chapters, I think we can look at Abimelech and look back and see these people saw that this guy was blessed by God and they wanted to be friends with him. So they had a covenant of peace together, which was not like the covenant that at the end of this battle, the king of Sodom tried to make with Abraham as he tried to manipulate him into owing Sodom favors and such.
Yeah, that was awful sneaky.
But
I've
that
always
theme
thought
of,
so too.
Right. The theme of peace with the nations runs all throughout Genesis, if you're able to see it. And it's a little bit discriminate too, because he's not making alliances with those who are trying to manipulate God's elect, only those that are seeing, hey, you are really blessed by Yahweh. Yahweh seems awesome, so we want to be in your camp. We want to be loyal to him. Those are the guys that he makes peace with.
So how do you see this? You mentioned earlier that the climax of this story really takes place with Joseph. And before we jump into Joseph, can you walk us through a little bit of the other motif that you mentioned, the brothers kind of in conflict with each other? I think you call it the two goats in the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like I said, I call this the two goats motif because I think this needs to bring us back to Leviticus 16, where there are two goats in the Day of Atonement. For better or for worse, that's what I called it. But the reason I did that was to bring us to that.
Don't doubt yourself. That's a good name.
It seems a little clunky to me, but that's where I wanted to go. I just wanted to remind us always of the Day of Atonement, because it's a climax not only in the book of Leviticus, but it is the literary center of the Torah. I mean, it's a huge deal. And so it should be fitting that this motif brings us there, not least because, well, the brothers are more clearly linked to the goats of the Day of Atonement. And scholars from, ancient rabbis up to modern scholars like Mary Douglas, Karl Barth, have been seeing this. And there's a scholar named Andrei Orlov who's kind of compiled all the links into his book. And so I'm really working off of what he has done. and incorporating some other brothers that aren't explicitly linked to the Day of Atonement goats, but they fall within the greater pattern of the other brothers. And then kind of showing how this develops throughout the book of Genesis and climaxes on Joseph. So first of all, for those who don't have Leviticus 16 memorized, you have the high priest who comes, he cleanses himself with sacrifices, and then comes the cleansing of Israel, where he takes two goats who have lots cast over them to decide their fates. And in the Levitical system in the Bible, when you cast lots, that is Yahweh making a choice. That's not just rolling dice for the sake of randomness. That's Yahweh's election. So each goat is elected to its role. And like we've already talked about, there's a brother who is the elect one. So one goat is elected to be the goat for Azazel. Azazel is a wilderness entity, perhaps demonic figure would be some language some would recognize. And he gets to bear the sins of Israel on him and be exiled, cast out into the wilderness to bear those sins away from the camp. And I do like to point out that within this ritual, and you can read more Milgram on this, his commentary on Leviticus, this goat is not supposed to be cursed or to become sin himself, but rather he is more so a delivery goat of the sins.
A delivery goat.
The other goat, yeah, I was going to say delivery man, but no, he's a goat. So you have the other goat, which is the goat for Yahweh, and he gets slaughtered, and then his blood gets brought into the Holy of Holies and is used as a sin offering to purge the sin from Israel. And so one of these goats bears the sins, exiled out into the wilderness. The other goat gets brought closer to Yahweh's space and becomes a sin offering. Now, how does this map onto the brothers of Genesis? Well, there is a younger brother who is elected as firstborn, or the bearer of the seed of the woman promise. He becomes head of the family and passes that promise on down through his family line. The older brother, well, he's the natural firstborn in this culture. Mm-hmm. And just in case anyone's not aware, firstborn doesn't always mean literal firstborn. It's more of a title about who's leading the family. So the older brother, he should have been the firstborn in this culture, and so he doesn't get that. He's jealous of his younger brother, and he acts out of that jealousy. He does something often horrible to that younger brother, that elected brother. Well, despite this horrible act of jealousy, the older brother is often given protection by Yahweh. Then the older brother is exiled into the wilderness, just like the goat. The older brother is then surprisingly multiplied into a nation, which should surprise us since they are starting to look like they have that blessing to be fruitful and multiply, even though they're a murderous or treacherous brother. Well, that nation then goes on to be hostile to God's people at some point later in the biblical story. Meanwhile, the elect brother is brought closer to Yahweh's dwelling and often exalted. And then some of these elect brothers we're going to see are associated with an offering. And that's going to be really significant, as that's the part of what helps us see Joseph's climax of this story.
So some of the two goat motifs would be like Cain and Abel. Would you say that falls into that category? You're nodding, but they can't hear you nod.
Absolutely. That's the first time that it appears in the story. I said, yeah.
Oh, we got like a lag happening here in the audio. What are some other places? Like which stories would you encourage people to look at if they're wanting to find obviously everyone should go buy the book and then they can walk through this with you. But if someone's out there today and they're like, you know what, I want to see this in my Bible, what story would you encourage them to go look at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Cain and Abel, they are one of the easiest to see this in, because we see Cain, he doesn't bear sin, but he bears his punishment out into the wilderness, into the land of wandering. And so he looks very much like that goat, and that's a lot of what ancient commentators have looked to see. Okay, he bears something out into the wilderness. That sounds familiar. Meanwhile, Abel, if you read the book, I make a case that the offerings they are offering is a sin offering. And through some Hebrew wordplay with the fat of the flock that he offers, it sounds a lot like Abel's name. And so Abel is associated with this offering, with this sin offering. So that's the first place that you see this. And he's also accepted. So he's, this is a sacrifice just kind of mimicking the Levitical system. And so he's accepted before Yahweh's presence and so on. So he's kind of brought into Yahweh's dwelling, or at least accepted before him. The next you see this is with Ham and Shem, and they don't directly bear the marks of the two goats motif, but they bear kind of the first step of the hostility shown towards the elect brother, and then Shem being elected, and then the fates of the elect one are shown in their children because their stories are so brief that the motif kind of expands beyond them into their genealogies.
Hmm.
The next time you see it is Ham and Lot. They're not brothers, but Lot is literally Abraham's brother. Then you see this with Isaac and Ishmael, and you probably know that Ishmael was associated with the sacrifice pretty clearly in the narrative. Meanwhile, Ishmael, he is sent out to the wilderness of Paran. Then you have Jacob and Esau, who he is a hairy man, which the word for goat in Leviticus 16, and it's a pretty common word, but it's concentrated in Leviticus 16 and surrounding Esau, is Seir. Well, he goes to live in Seir, and the goat is Seir, and he is a hairy Seir man. And so it's the same consonants for goat that are used to describe Esau's hairiness and the place that he goes to live later. And so he is, again, through this linked to the Day of Atonement goat.
Wow.
Now, the fun part about this is with Joseph. And Joseph, he is actually associated with both goats, and that's going to be significant later on. So Joseph, he is replaced by a slaughtered goat that is used to trick Jacob, and his robes are dipped in the blood. Blood has not been mentioned since Genesis 9, where it is commanded that man is not to spill blood, and then in Genesis 4, where Abel's blood is spilled in association with the sin offering. So again, that alone is significant. And we can really look straight from Joseph back to Genesis 4, because the instance in Genesis 9 is just a prohibition of murder, which is playing off what just happened in Genesis 4 as Cain kills Abel.
Mm.
So through that, he's associated with the goat for Yahweh, the slaughtered goat. And then he is also, because of his brother's sins, he is exiled out of the land of promise, exiled into Egypt, which is literally often treated as death. There's a motif that as he goes down to Egypt, Jacob goes down to Sheol, and also the pit is often a place in Scripture that is referred to as, or at least metaphorically, Sheol or death. And so, Joseph first, he is put into a pit, and then he's brought back out, and then he goes to Potiphar's, and because of what happens there, he's put into another pit, the prison. It's explicitly called a pit, and then he is exiled out of that pit. And so with him, so far, we have Joseph as a character who plays the role of the goat for Azazel, going out into the wilderness, and as the goat for Yahweh, who is a sin offering for the people. But we also have this kind of death and resurrection motif happening to Joseph as he goes down into Egypt and as he goes in and out of the pit a couple of times. And so this should kind of pique our interest, because maybe the first couple of times that we heard about a brother associated with a sin offering or just an offering in general, okay, that's weird, but it only happened a couple of times, no big deal. But then we see this again, and this should start to, okay, what's going on here, especially here at the climax of the Genesis story? Well, once Joseph goes on to, or gets brought out of the pit and exiled before Pharaoh, well, what happens there? This is the end of his exodus. His exodus began at the same time that he was exiled as the goat for Azazel. At that point, he is in a land of exile and a place of ruin and is in need of an exodus. Well, let me point out here first that Pharaoh, he plays the role literally of Yahweh in this. And I just want to point out this is just a literary stand-in. The author takes some things that only Yahweh does throughout the story and applies it to Pharaoh. And so it just, again, should pique our interest, because in the beginning, God is the one who gives authority to Adam. He also, at the end of Genesis 3, he creates priestly garments for Adam and Eve, and he gives names to Adam. He gives a wife to Adam, and then there's also a command for Adam to not touch one thing. Now, all of these things are what Pharaoh do for Joseph. He gives him authority. He gives him priestly garments, the gold chain and the fine linen that he gives him whenever he brings him into his presence, or whenever he says that Joseph is wise and should be in command. He also renames Joseph, which, if you read the book, you'll see how naming is part of the recreation motif as well. And then he also gives Joseph a wife and gives him a command not to touch one thing, which is the throne. And then also Joseph, he shaves his head before he meets Pharaoh, or he shaves before meeting Pharaoh, which the only time we've seen that again is whenever Jacob shaves before going to meet God after his exodus out of Padan Aram.
Yeah, I
And
know.
also we see Nazarites who shave their head to meet God.
Yeah, I think that's all really cool details when you begin to look at this. And the Bible does this in a couple different places. It calls Moses. It says, you're going to be like Yahweh to Pharaoh. And so you get this idea of God isn't saying you are me. He's saying that in this story or in this moment, you are going to be a picture or a type of me. And so
Exactly.
with the Pharaoh of Joseph's story, you get this idea of what a king is supposed to be like. When he hears wisdom, he responds in a positive way. And I've never read anything about it. I'm not even sure if there's anything there. But then when you compare him to the other Pharaoh of the Exodus story, who's the opposite, he's a pursuer of blood and of power through manipulation. But I'm fascinated with Joseph's story. And I hadn't thought about several of the things that you point out here in the story. Why do you say that this is the climax of the story? What do you mean when you focus our attention in on Joseph?
Yeah. So, I mean, this bleeds really well from the previous point of Pharaoh playing Yahweh literally. What's significant about that is all those things that Pharaoh is doing for Joseph, God did for Adam. And so Joseph is a new Adam. We started with an Adam at the beginning of the book, and he failed. There was one thing he was not to touch, and he failed. Joseph, there was one thing that he was not to touch, not only for Pharaoh, but for Potiphar. He was not to touch his wife, and he passed that test. And so, having passed in a sense, the Genesis 3 test to not touch the one thing, this made him a fitting character to be a new Adam and to be exalted back into Adam's place. Now, this isn't the final redemption of all humanity, and the end of the story, which is probably why Pharaoh has to stand in for Yahweh at this point. Because if Yahweh was the one to do this for Joseph, then Joseph would have been our Messiah that we've been looking for. But sadly, that's not the end of the story, and we have to wait another couple thousand years for this to play out. But that's really why. That's why I think that Pharaoh playing this role is so significant, because with what happens to Joseph as a new Adam, we now have an elect character who has been associated with the goat who bears away the sins of Israel, who is sacrificed and purges the sins from Israel as he comes into Yahweh's presence. He has gone through an exodus. He is going to lead an exodus shortly for his family. He has been made a priest and a king. He has been made a new creation. And he has been tested and passed. We're going to see that he's about to reconcile his brothers, reconcile his family. He's about to save and deliver the world. And so all of these things work together, I think, to give us a picture for, okay, who is this serpent-crushing seed of the woman going to look like? We've been looking for an elect one that will finally pass the test and accomplish all this. We have one that passed the test and has all these other Day of Atonement and Exodus associations with him, along with the way he reconciles his family and has peace with the nations and brings deliverance. And so all of these narrative tensions that we've been seeing since the beginning chapters of Genesis are now kind of coming to a head in Joseph and giving us a picture of the Messiah, of the chosen one, of the seed of the woman. And we'll see in a couple chapters that Judah is the one that this Messiah is going to come from. And so that picture transfers over to Judah's king. But here at the end of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, we have a picture of the one who's going to reconcile the problems of the first few chapters of Genesis, which we see very clearly come to a head in Jesus.
A really great book by this, guys, if you're intrigued by Joseph, other than obviously Through the Waters, which is a great book, but is David C. Mitchell's Messiah ben Joseph. Does a lot with this motif as well. There's an interview on the Naked Bible podcast. I think it's episode 386, Messiah, son of Joseph, is really cool. This is one of the gifts that keeps on giving, the Messiah motifs and things there. So I definitely think you're did a great job in the book of highlighting this and drawing the attention to celebrating a little thought of section of who Messiah is and what it is that Jesus is up to, not just in the Gospels, but throughout the whole Old Testament, this redemptive arc of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's I'm not one to want to try to find Jesus under every single nook and cranny, every rock, but I think that these motifs, I mean, just trying to follow what the author has clearly done with intention, not just by accident. For him to so early on in the book of the Bible in Genesis to give us a picture of what he's going to look like, to me, that I find that just very amazing. I hope that it encourages the faith of some who maybe struggle to put together how is Jesus of the New Testament the God of the Old Testament, or how are the New Testament and the Old Testament related? And so just even some questions like that I'm sure we've all discussed and gone into, but I think it can help bolster that and encourage someone's faith, someone especially who maybe has reasons to not believe. And this can be even used as an apologetic to help someone see, from the beginning, we've been expecting Jesus. And I don't know, I'm hoping that this is a help practically to people as well, just to see this, or even to use this as an apologetic for how the Bible is a unified work. I don't go into that in the book, but maybe it could be co-opted for that argument as well.
Yeah, I've always thought of Joseph through the tree motif. So many of the stories of the patriarchs and things in Genesis and beyond have this important events happening around trees. And then Joseph is actually described as a tree. He is a fruitful bough that extends over the garden wall. And just this idea of Eden extending itself out to be a blessing. And then you just can't help but think of Jesus' teachings. He says, what is the heart of the law? What's the most important part? Is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and then to love your neighbor as yourself. It's this idea that our personal faith is not just a private thing that makes us better people, but that it's a calling to image God and to be hands and feet to our faith, to be out there making people's lives better because of the love that we have for our God. And I think your book does an awesome job of just celebrating the coolness of the story and the way that the text talks about these things. If you haven't picked up Through the Waters, you need to pick it up. If you're not listening to Caleb, he's got his own podcast. You can find him there. What's the name of your podcast again?
Yeah, it's the Bible in Context podcast, and we are, come join our discussion on our Facebook discussion group. We've got, we're on Apple, we're on Spotify, YouTube, and a few other platforms out there. So yeah, definitely come check it out.
So you've also been on Answers to Giant Questions, and you've also been on Carrie's podcast over there at Genesis Marks the Spot. And so if you want to hear more from our good friend Caleb, you can shoot over to those awesome podcasts and hear his thoughts. And otherwise, man, I can't thank you enough for coming on and being willing to talk with us about your book.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been great. And yeah, like I've said from the beginning, I just hope that this is a blessing to the church, and not only kind of tickles our academic ears, but will also just bolster our view of who we are, who God is, and help us to serve him with greater conviction and with clearer purpose.
Well, you've not heard the last of Caleb. He is a friend of mine and somebody who I've been chatting with a little bit about some cool stuff that we're going to get into. But if you want to pick up his book, where would you recommend people go to buy your book?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. I think that's probably the most accessible place for a lot of people, but it's on Whiff and Stock, my publisher, their website. You can find it at Barnes & Nobles. It's really on a lot of platforms now, I've noticed. So you can probably find it in most places you want to get, but Amazon is a good go-to.
He really wants you to show up at his house really early in the morning and knock on the door asking for a copy of the book. But I know that the story of Joseph does not get the attention that it's due, and so I really loved how you made my mind expand and just appreciate the beauty of Scripture. And I would encourage you guys to get out there, read the book, but most important of all, to remember that Jesus is the God of gods, the Lord of lords, mighty and awesome.